Welcome to the Super Gamer Podcast. Welcome to the new Super Gamer Podcast, episode 113. Our guest this week is the manager and editor of archaeogaming.com, a doctoral candidate at the Institute for Digital Exploration, Department of History, University of South Florida, studier of digital cultural heritage, a trained archaeologist, a user of 3D models. We have Kaitlyn Kingsland. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So, archaeogaming is largely what we're here to talk about. And as I said right before we started, it seems a little beyond me. I did my best to understand what it is. I'll try and describe it, and then you can correct me or add to it.
Yeah, sure.
So as I understand, archaeogaming, it's super broad. It's like history of games, like the physical history of games, the history depicted in games, digital material, artifacts within digital worlds, using games as teaching tools. And I tried to distill it, and what I got was it's the study of games using archaeological methods.
That is correct. Yeah, it covers a large range of things, but the heart of it is using archaeology to study games, whether that be the physical space or digital space within games.
Cool. And then archaeogaming.com, which you took over in 2019, started by Andrew Reinhardt in 2013. That is a blog dedicated to the discussion of archaeogaming.
Yeah, it's actually like the foundational blog on what archaeogaming is, and it's really grown over the years thanks to Andrew's work.
So the whole field of archaeogaming is like less than 10 years old.
Yeah, it's an emerging subfield of archaeology.
So does that make for a lot of freedom? Is it more difficult being in a new subfield?
Well, it gives you a lot of freedom in terms of like there's so much of things to study and so many questions to ask. But it also makes it difficult in just trying to like publish and in more the traditional academic space. It's a little bit more difficult. But in terms of like just talking to people about games and talking about archaeology and whatever you want to look at and study, it's wide open. There's so much to do.
Right. What beyond preservation is the goal of archaeogaming?
Yeah. So, I mean, preservation is always important in kind of all cultural heritage and archaeology, to me, at the very least. But archaeogaming looks at not only digital games and physical games, so like tabletop games, as artifacts, but also as like places we can study culture. So like human culture that's being built in gaming worlds, and how people think about archaeology, and just, how like the No Man's Sky archaeological project started by Andrew Reinhardt looks at how procedural generation develops culture and how it spreads it out across the galaxy of No Man's Sky, or the universe of No Man's Sky. So it's kind of everything that you could possibly think about archaeology in games or outside of games. So just kind of looking at it, having fun.
The procedurally generated thing, like No Man's Sky, that's interesting because, I mean, obviously there's a set of parameters it has to work with, but like it's not like humans going in there and setting everything up. Like as things are being discovered in that, even the developers are like, oh, neat. I didn't put that there.
Yeah. And I mean, procedural generation is machine based and not really machine learning, but like, it's an algorithm. And so how does that work? How are machines translating our parameters into the gaming space?
Right. And as I was thinking about it today, like, as far as human interaction, like obviously a lot of archaeology is like we study physical objects and see what that meant to culture and human interaction at the time and all that. And now we, of course, have digital meeting spaces, which are in some ways just as valid as and useful as material world spaces. So like the idea of digital archaeology and studying how people are interacting in games makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I mean, we're talking about like, so there's EVE Online, which the goal is to build corporations in space, but all of it's based around like the culture that people make within their guilds and, with other guilds or corporations in this game. So like it's a very interesting way to watch how online spaces create their own culture from like a base of a game.
I've said this on the podcast a few times, I think, but I'm super interested in how language develops in games. Like Rocket League, there's quick chats like "what a save, nice shot," blah blah. Dark Souls, there's messages you leave, and like memes in the game kind of come out of like people leave messages that you expect to see, and Journey, the chirping and stuff like that. Like that's so interesting to me. I think in another life, like that's what I would like to study.
Yeah, I mean, you can study that now too. Archaeogaming is supposed to be accessible to everyone. So if you want to write something about what you think about archaeology and I guess memes as the artifacts in games, it's totally a valid course of study as well.
As far as you mentioned artifacts there, as far as it seems like any aspect of a game, be it sprites or early versions of a game, patches of a game, all that, it's all artifacts. So as far as like early access and patches and each iteration of a game, studying those, is there something we can learn beyond like, well, this change was made because it made the game more enjoyable?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can ask, like, why did it make the game more enjoyable? What kind of interactions were happening within the game space that the developers decided that needed to change? Or why, were there comments about it? So I play a lot of Satisfactory, which I've talked about on the blog before. And it's very driven, like, in improvements to the game by the comment board that Coffee Stain has put up. So, user complaints and user feedback is actively incorporated into the game. So not only are you having developers touch and create the space, but you're also having the community developing around the games influence it. And so I think asking the questions of like why and how and what kind of levels of interaction are developers having is a very interesting way to look at it. In terms of like Valorant, I feel like Riot has a very specific way that they want the game to be played and a very specific vision. And so they're willing to make these changes to the game, even on like maps that have existed since launch. I think it's like, 2 years ago, 1 year ago. And so the artifacts that we see in older videos, like, well, what has Riot changed? Because they have this very specific way they want this game to be played. So I think that's, super interesting way to look at the game space as a built human environment.
Right. One interesting thing, back to the digital worlds and digital meeting space and that, from Andrew Reinhardt's Archaeogaming book, something that stood out to me was the question of whether there are digital worlds that deserve preservation, like a UNESCO heritage site for a virtual world. And yeah, I mean, like I think back, I still play the new version of Diablo 2, but right up until that launch, like I would go back every 6 months and play Diablo 2 again. And it was funny to see like all the infrastructure is still there, but like just bots, just like spam bots everywhere, and like maybe 10 actual humans. It's just kind of like, wow, this is a ghost town except for all these bots.
Yeah. I think we can preserve games in terms of like putting them as art in museums, which is definitely starting to like become a thing. And so like having the digital space preserved because it's deemed like artwork is one way like that we'd want to preserve it, but also like, yeah, what did this look like before everybody abandoned whatever the online space is? As a kid, I used to play a lot of RuneScape, and so there's like old RuneScape and then there's new RuneScape, and the changes are like they're not massive, but they're enough that like people wanted the older version, so they kept it. So now you have like two versions of RuneScape existing at the same time for the different audiences that they've created.
Right, and World of Warcraft actually has a totally similar thing going on.
Yeah, unfortunately I do not play World of Warcraft, but I have heard that they recently revamped a lot of the space. And so that's when like videos and playthroughs and merch really become an interesting aspect of artifacts, right? Like it existed one way before and it's radically changed, but the game didn't change. And so we've preserved it in more documentation versions, like videos or pictures, rather than just like archiving it. Though archiving the original code is super interesting, and you can look in the code itself as archaeologists and study what has been changed as well.
So what makes this similar to a question I already asked, but like what makes this different from like there's a lot of games preservation societies or people really trying to save those old games. What makes this archaeology?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Archaeology isn't all about preservation. It's mostly about trying to understand humans and the human past and culture through the stuff that we've left behind. So preservation is really important in order to allow you to explore those questions and study human culture. So the preservation societies are doing great work in helping us save these built environments in these digital spaces so that we archaeologists can study it and ask the questions about culture and things that have been left behind.
Right. That seems like really getting into the nitty grit when you're looking at, what does this patch say about our culture?
Yeah, I mean, there are some big things that you're like, that patch really, that would say a lot about culture. And then there's some other smaller patches that seem less consequential. And they probably are, but it's an interesting thing to explore. There are questions to be asked about it.
Right. I have a question along the same vein, and I'm sorry to keep framing questions this way, but in 2019, you had a blog post about the scaling method the game theorists used to determine the size of the map in Fallout 76. And you talked about how this method can be useful for archaeo gamers. And I'm just wondering, like, why do we want to measure distance in a fictional world? Is it for deeper understanding of the lore in that world or something else?
Yeah, I mean, at the base of it, lore can be considered like the history of the digital world. And so if you're trying to understand a question about human culture in the lore, then measurement might be helpful. But also measurement is important in understanding like space and distance between things. And so a lot of archaeo gamers are using kind of what you can use within a game space that doesn't already have a built-in measurement system. So like Assassin's Creed Odyssey uses meters, but like World of Warcraft doesn't. A lot of games don't have measurement, and so if you're trying to measure like the size of a human-built civilization, so like users making houses or towns or what have you, you'd want there to be a way to figure out how large it is and how much space there is, because space is directly linked to different levels of like influence and prestige and resources. So it's an important question to ask.
You have a blog post July 2020 about the board game Terraforming Mars, and you talk about how points allocation gives us a look at what our society considers good and bad, like setting off a nuke is negative points, installing solar power is positive points. And you mentioned how the whole corporations leading the charge and Terraforming Mars, like, obviously reflects where we are now in the real world. It made me wonder, like, were there games in the ancient world or, even say like 500 years ago, like, were there games? Could you draw such clear parallels to the political and cultural structures of the time?
That is a very good question. Unfortunately, within the research that I've done in the academic space, a lot of ancient games or historic games have not really been preserved as well as we'd like. So, you have like dice found in graves, and you figure that it's probably related to a game, but there's not necessarily a lot of documentation. But like, Monopoly was made within an archaeological period, right? It's over 100 years old about, and Monopoly says a lot about the culture in which it was developed. I mean, it was created to show people how capitalism beats down everybody and how it ultimately one person comes out on top. And so historically looking at Monopoly is very interesting, at least from my perspective as an archaeologist. And I'm sure that there are probably plenty of games that I do not know about from ancient or historic civilizations, that the same can be interpreted.
While we're on the subject of ancient dice, very cool to see 20-sided dice in ancient Rome. Like to think that they're playing Dungeons and Dragons. They
might be. Role-playing's not new.
Fair enough. Do you have any idea, like, how old does that date back?
The metadata on the website says I am not an expert in ancient gaming by any means, but those people who are will definitely be considered archaeo gamers.
And then you also have on your Twitter, you've got pictures of 6-sided rhomboid dice. And I just have to say that that's a terrible design for a 6-sided die. It looks like you're not going to hit a couple of those numbers.
Yeah, I kind of like our design for 6-sided dice.
Have you ever got to play, like, or even roll any of these ancient dice?
No, definitely not. That I would love to, but I would also be very worried about damaging the object.
Right.
You don't really get to play with artifacts like that unless you're pretty sure that it'll withstand, which is a great reason 3D printing and scanning exists, which is the other half of my work.
Mm-hmm. Compare your work with 3D modeling to what, games, especially VR games, could possibly allow the public to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. The gaming space, especially like the ability for independent developers to make really high quality and impressive looking games, is revolutionary in cultural heritage. It makes it a lot more accessible for archaeologists and historians to also make games. And so when we look at 3D scanning different environments, all of the scans can translate directly into making assets for 3D games. And so there's no reason that you can't include historical artifacts as they exist today, or even as they would have existed within the gaming space.
I remember as a kid, like, I don't feel like this is far off. This would be paleontology stuff, but which I know you've mentioned before, like, people tend to confuse archaeology and paleontology. But like a local museum where I am would have, I'm sure lots of places do this, but you go as a field trip as a kid and they've got like a sandbox set up with fake dinosaur bones to dig up. And I feel like this is almost an extension of that.
Yeah. So that's kind of like a play version of come and excavate on a paleontological dig, and definitely being able to teach people how to do archaeology in a digital space prepares you before you go out into the field, because obviously you dig once, you can't undo what you've dug, and so we're very aware that it's a destructive science, but the only way to learn how to do physical world archaeology is by doing it. But there have been people trying to develop for academic purposes ways to train archaeologists by making a simulation of a dig, and then you do the actions and you learn how to do it.
As far as games used to present research, like how big an issue is it that games, much like books and movies, like they're often a fictionalized version of a history? Like, are we in danger of, a kid going to school and doing a presentation on how like Nazi zombies were in World War II?
I mean, that's definitely a concern, right? But, there's no reason that you can't, as a game developer, reach out and ask questions or have permanent members on your staff who are experts in the field that you want to make a game in. But, you'll talk to archaeologists who say that the reason that they got into archaeology was because they were playing historically based games, however accurate they were or weren't. And it's definitely a really great way to just reach out to the community and also to present your stuff to people. That if we all just kind of sit in our offices and talk to other academics, nobody's going to learn anything from us. And so reaching out to the public and other people who are just interested in history through gaming kind of brings us all into why history is cool and why we all like it.
Mm-hmm. Having an archaeology consultant for a game dev, probably a good idea. What about the other way? Like Should archaeologists, because, if we're going to be using games to present research, should archaeologists have like a game designer on hand to brainstorm how we can best record and communicate what we're finding?
Yeah, absolutely. There's the first studio that comes to mind is Dig It. It's based in Bethesda, Maryland, and the company is founded by archaeologists. It's a game studio created to generate historical games for like the K through 12 environment. And definitely like archaeologists who want to engage the public in a gaming format should definitely work outside of the field of archaeology and bring game developers in and asset designers. And certainly we can't do it all on our own.
I think I know the answer to this. I think it's Heaven's Vault, but maybe it's changed. What game is the best or most interesting depiction of archaeology?
As far as I know, it's Heaven's Vault. Yeah.
So why is that?
It walks you through this environment, and the robot that accompanies you also helps you to ask the questions, and it steers you in the directions of like what questions archaeologists are asking and how we come to our information and synthesize, the ideas that we have about a culture. And so it like shows you kind of what archaeologists do rather than, using Lara Croft as an example of destroying a site and killing things.
Right. Do you get a lot of do people often consider archaeology to be like Lara Croft, Indiana Jones, that kind of
Absolutely.
Are they upset to hear what it really is?
I don't think anyone's ever been upset when I tell them that that's not what archaeology is, but certainly it's a shock. It's kind of like the media's portrayal of archaeology has done a disservice in saying that it's just a bunch of people looting and stealing, which, historically it was, but it's certainly not anymore.
Right. But I mean, looting aside, it certainly makes it seem like an exciting field.
Yeah, I mean...
Not that it isn't, but it's exciting in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, your life's not like constantly in danger in most places when you're doing an excavation. But there are certainly places where, excavating is very dangerous, but I don't think you're going to, pull out a gun and start shooting people. They generally have security assigned to you in that sort of case. So.
And I imagine as far as how dangerous excavation can be, certainly that's got to be where 3D modeling or presenting things as games comes in handy, right?
Yeah, and so one of the things I like to talk about a lot is kind of the intersection between archaeogaming and the digital archaeology work I do is accessibility. And so like not a lot of people really have the time or the money or the desire even to like travel to a very remote site and see the archaeological past for themselves. And so within a game space, you can present that and then also present the interpretation that you have of it and show people what life was like, or just walking through the space without having to get like, however difficult of a visa or reservations or flights to whatever remote part of the world that it's in.
Before we get off the topic, sorry, is it bothersome that so many games are like centered around looting?
There are certainly people who are concerned by the idea of that. I think the concern is centered around the issue that, we're so connected to our avatars in games. It's a very second person experience. So we feel like we are the character that we're playing. And so the concern stems around, well, if it's okay to loot in games, it's okay to loot in real life. And I think it's a very valid concern, but, as an adult who's playing games, who knows not to loot sites, it's not as bothersome to me as it is to other people.
Right. I guess you can draw a parallel to the whole violence in games things. Like, hopefully you're mature enough to understand that what I'm doing here is not actually okay in real life.
Yeah, I mean, I play Valorant. It's a first-person shooter. I am not going to go out and do that in real life. I know that that's not okay.
Going back to your blog, a lot of the posts explore archaeogaming in games that take place in the future, like Detroit, Cyberpunk 2077, Horizon Zero Dawn, Death Stranding. A lot of them are like dystopian futures. But I guess I associate archaeology with studying the past. So What is it about studying the future that is archaeological, and what are we learning here?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So it's a built future, right? It's humans in whatever year they're designing the game coming up with an idea about what the future might look like, and building an environment or a story or characters around that. And so it's less about asking like what the future will look like, which is certainly something you could explore, but more about asking like what was happening during the game development process or in the years culturally, that led to the design elements within the game that created that future.
Cool. I believe this is submitted, not yet published, but you've got an article, Stories and Changing Social Norms, exploring how video games reflect society through the case study of Dragon Age.
Yes, the title has changed a little bit, but I'll certainly be posting it on Twitter and on the blog as soon as it comes out. But yeah, so it's using the case study of Dragon Age, released starting in the early aughts, the early 2000s, and the last game being released in 2014. Obviously, they're working on a new Dragon Age now, but it explores how things have changed within the decade that the three games were released, and so it was kind of something I felt playing through it. You felt like different racist and sexist undertones shifting as you played through the games, but it was never like explicitly mentioned in any sort of academic literature. And so if we look at the environment and within the story, you see this kind of shift of like, let's include different people and different backgrounds and different stories into the game that shifted with kind of the cultural development um, or change that happened between like 2006 and 2014. I mean, 2006, I remember being a very different time than 2014, and especially a very different time in 2022. Um, but on top of looking at Dragon Age, it compares it to another game, the Mass Effect trilogy, made by the same studio, where we also see that happen. And then looking outside of BioWare itself, the developer, looking at Naughty Dog in the Uncharted series with the similar release timeline, you see the change happen as well. So it's clearly something, it's demonstrating some sort of cultural shift towards inclusivity, which I think can be felt through our media and also just like having lived through it. But then it's demonstrating how that is shown within the built environment as well.
Yeah, that'll be an interesting read, especially, following one studio to really be able to see that development.
Yeah, and the important part of including Naughty Dog is that like maybe it was just BioWare, right? Like what if BioWare was just deciding to be more inclusive? But when we look at other studios, you see the same sort of trend. So it's clearly not just like one studio making a choice. It's kind of just the way that things shifted culturally.
What is your dream dig or project or anything?
That is a very difficult question. I kind of really just love what I do. So I love archaeo gaming. I love digital archaeology. I love just traditional archaeology. So asking me like what my dream dig is or my, dream thing to study is like, well, anything related to this. I love what I do. So yeah.
Cool. Anything you can say, like what's coming up next on the blog, or is that just too far ahead?
I have been working on a post about unpacking, which
Oh,
I don't.
yes.
Yes. So it's like, the way that you pack your game or your games. Well, I have a lot of games, so when I move, I definitely pack a significant number of games. But with like the way you pack and what you unpack, the idea of the artifacts, or in this case, the person's belongings, tells the story. And so there's like no written text, and all you have is the music and the stuff, and it's very archaeological in how you discover the story.
If there were any virtual world that you could preserve, what would it be?
That's also a hard question. I think we should preserve them all. I know that's kind of a cop out, but they're all very cool for all many, many different reasons. And there's definitely games I probably don't know about a lot of games. So, yeah.
All right. Well, Kaitlyn Kingsland, you can find at Kingsland_K on Twitter, at Archeo Gaming on Twitter, and archeogaming.com is the blog. Kaitlyn Kingsland, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.